The flowers were perfect. That is the first thing I remember thinking when I walked into Greater Tabernacle Baptist Church that Saturday morning in early June. White peonies and eucalyptus wrapped around every pew end, tied with ivory ribbon. The sanctuary smelled like something between a garden and a prayer. The morning light came through the stained glass and laid itself across the aisle in colors: amber, rose, a deep and tender blue. And if you didn't know what I was carrying in my chest, you might have looked at me standing in the back of that sanctuary and thought I was a woman about to witness something beautiful. And I was. That was the hardest part. My name is Loretta Mae Simmons Cross. I am 58 years old. I am a retired court clerk, a mother of 3 grown children, a grandmother of 4, and a woman who has been a member of Greater Tabernacle for going on 26 years. I have watched this sanctuary hold funerals and revivals and homecomings. I have watched it hold grief and joy and everything in between. I have seen this room full, and I have seen it quiet, and I have never once walked into it without feeling that I was stepping onto ground that meant something. That morning it was dressed for a wedding. My niece, Adrienne's wedding. Adrienne Celeste Simmons is 32 years old. She is my brother Marcus's only daughter, which makes her mine in every way that counts. She has her father's laugh and her late mother's eyes and a warmth about her that draws people in without trying. She became a registered nurse at 24, bought her own home at 27, and spent the years in between building the kind of life that makes the people who love her proud in a quiet, steady way. She was not a woman who needed anyone to complete her. She wanted a partner, a companion, a man who could stand beside her in the life she had already built. 14 months ago, she had found him, or so we believed. His name, the name we knew, was Elijah Cornelius Beaumont, 40 years old. He had come to Greater Tabernacle through a mutual connection in the healthcare community, since he presented himself as a healthcare administrator who had relocated from Atlanta to take a regional director position with a hospital network in our city. He was tall, well-spoken, dressed well without ostentation, and he had a smile that arrived slightly before everything else about him and stayed a little longer after. The kind of smile that made rooms feel warmer. He called Adrienne my promise from the 3rd month of their relationship. Said it was because she represented everything God had promised him after a long season of waiting. She had told me about it over the phone one Sunday evening, her voice soft in a way I had not heard it in years, and I had sat in my kitchen and thanked God that my girl had found someone. I want you to hold that picture. Hold the flowers and the light and the ivory ribbon and the sound of the organ warming up and my niece somewhere in the bridal suite at the back of this building, being beautiful. Hold all of it, because at 11:47 that morning, when Elijah Cornelius Beaumont stood at the altar of Greater Tabernacle Baptist Church, looked at Adrienne walking toward him down that aisle, and said, audibly, emotionally, in a voice that carried to the 5th row, "There she is. My promise." My brother Marcus, who was standing 3 feet to my left in the family pew, leaned forward slowly and put his mouth near my ear. And he whispered, "Loretta, I know him." I turned to look at my brother. Marcus is 55 years old. He spent 22 years as an investigator for the county district attorney's office before he retired 2 years ago. He is not a man who says things he doesn't mean. He is not a man prone to confusion or drama or mistaken identity. When Marcus Simmons says he knows something, he knows it the way a man knows it who has spent 2 decades in rooms where the truth had to be established beyond reasonable doubt. His face was not confused. It was not uncertain. It was the face of a man who has just walked into a room and recognized a problem he thought was behind him. I grabbed his wrist under the cover of the pew and squeezed it once, hard, which in our private sibling language means, "Not here, not yet, hold on." He gave me one small nod and straightened up, and we both looked forward at the altar where Adrienne was now 4 rows away, her bouquet trembling slightly because she was crying already, and the man she was about to marry was watching her with an expression so practiced in tenderness that I had to ask God right then to steady my hands. How do you stop a wedding without destroying a woman's dignity in the house of God? I did not know the answer yet. But I knew I had to find one before this ceremony reached its end. I could not get to Marcus for a real conversation until the processional was complete and the pastor had opened the ceremony and the congregation had settled. Every second of those opening minutes felt like standing on a surface that was slowly tilting. Everything looked the same, everything sounded the same, and only I and my brother knew that the floor was moving. The pastor, Reverend Darnell Eugene Whitfield, is a man I have respected for 26 years. He is 63, deliberate in everything he does, the kind of pastor who preaches like a man who has read the scripture and also lived it. His wife, First Lady Gloria Whitfield, sat in her customary seat to the left of the pulpit, a handsome woman in her late 50s, silver-laced locks pinned beneath a deep plum hat, her expression one of composed, watchful warmth. On the front right pew, in her usual place, sat Mother Dorothy Jean Alcott. 81 years old, had been at Greater Tabernacle since before the current building was constructed. She wore white the way she always wore white on special Sundays. Head to toe, immaculate, with a single gold brooch at her collar. She was watching the altar with the alert, measuring attention that elderly church mothers bring to ceremonial occasions. The look of a woman cataloging everything for future reference. I noticed her glance at Elijah twice in those first few minutes, just twice. And I noticed that she did not look away immediately, the way you look away when something confirms what you expected. She looked slightly longer, the way you look when something does not quite confirm what you expected. I filed that away. The moment Reverend Whitfield invited the congregation to be seated for the reading of Scripture, I slid close to Marcus on the pew and kept my voice at the level of breath. "Talk," I said. He kept his eyes forward. He said, "His name is not Elijah Beaumont." I felt the floor tilt further. "Then what is it?" He said, "I knew him as Calvin Reese. He operated under that name in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. 5 years ago, he was the subject of a fraud investigation. Wire fraud, identity deception, financial exploitation. 2 of his victims were women. Both met him through faith community networks. Both believed they were in committed relationships with him. Both gave him significant sums of money for investment opportunities that did not exist." He paused. "The investigation was mine. I sat across a table from that man for 4 hours in an interview room. That is him." I said, "Was he convicted?" Marcus said, "The case collapsed. One victim moved out of state and declined to cooperate further. The second had her own complications. The money had come from her late husband's estate and family members who didn't want the exposure. Without cooperative witnesses, the DA couldn't proceed." He walked. He paused. "He has used more than one name. Calvin Reese was what we had on the arrest record. He has introduced himself differently in different places, but his face does not change. And I know that face." I looked at the man at the front of the sanctuary. Elijah Cornelius Beaumont. Calvin Reese. He was holding Adrienne's hands now as Reverend Whitfield spoke, his thumb moving slowly across her knuckles in a gesture of tenderness so convincing that the woman in the pew in front of me had already pressed a handkerchief to the corner of her eye. I said, "Does Adrienne know any of this?" Marcus shook his head. I said, "Does he know you're her father?" She told him she has a father and an uncle. She did not tell him what I did for a living. I was deliberately kept from meeting him. There was always a reason we weren't in the same room. A schedule conflict, a last-minute change. I let it go too many times. I see that now. He looked down briefly. He was careful, but not careful enough about today. I put my hand over his. He said very quietly, "I am not going to watch my daughter marry a man who has done this before. But I am not going to destroy her in the process of stopping it." I squeezed his hand once. I said, "Then let me think." And I started thinking. The thing about a church wedding is that it has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward the altar, and it does not release it easily. The music, the flowers, the clothes, the tears, all of it is designed to move in one direction, and to interrupt that motion requires something stronger than doubt. It requires something that can be seen and confirmed. I had Marcus's word, which was to me more reliable than most documents. But I was a court clerk for 27 years. I understood the difference between what you know and what you can demonstrate. And I understood that standing up in the middle of a wedding ceremony in the house of God and saying that man is a fraud without something physical to anchor, it was not justice. It was chaos. And chaos in a sanctuary has a way of landing on the wrong person. I needed something else. I looked at the man at the altar the way I had learned to look at courtroom witnesses over decades. Not for what they showed, but for what they managed. He was managing a great deal. His suit was beautiful, clearly tailored. His boutonniere matched Adrienne's bouquet exactly. He had thought about every visible detail. He had rehearsed the smile and the stillness and the way he turned toward Adrienne when she spoke. What careful people forget is that they cannot think about everything. I thought about Mother Alcott and the way she had looked at him twice with that unresolved expression. I thought about the Women's Ministry fundraising dinner 8 months earlier, an evening event here at Greater Tabernacle, about 60 women, a catered meal. Adrienne had brought Elijah briefly at the end of the evening to introduce him to a few people. They had stayed perhaps 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, he had spoken with Mother Alcott for several minutes in what I had thought at the time was simply a gracious young man making time for the oldest woman in the room. But when they parted, I had caught a flicker on Mother Alcott's face that I could not name. Not warmth, not coldness. Something more like a question that had not finished forming. I had not thought of it again until this moment. The ceremony had a moment built into it. Reverend Whitfield had told the congregation at the opening that there would be a brief musical interlude during which the couple would take a moment for private prayer at the altar while the choir sang. It was a tradition at Greater Tabernacle weddings. It would last several minutes. During those minutes, the congregation's attention would be on the choir loft at the back. Movement in the side aisles, while not invisible, would be natural and largely unnoticed. I leaned back to Marcus and said quietly, "The Women's Ministry dinner. 8 months ago. He spoke with Mother Alcott for several minutes and something didn't sit right with her afterward. I need to know what it was." Marcus went still. Then, "Go during the choir. I'll use that same time to check my case archives on my phone. I still have access to the files." I said, "And the best man, Deshawn. He's holding the groom's ring." Marcus said, "If we need the ceremony slowed down further, we'll find a reason. But let's get what we need first." The choir rose. Their first note filled the sanctuary the way the first note of a great choir always does, like something larger than sound, like something with weight and temperature. The congregation shifted, heads turned upward toward the loft. At the altar, Adrienne and Elijah knelt together on the cushioned rail, their heads bowed. I moved. I came down the side aisle quietly and smoothly, the way a woman moves in church when she is going about purposeful business and does not want to draw attention. I had done it 1,000 times as an usher. My body knew how to be invisible in a sanctuary. Mother Dorothy Jean Alcott's pew was the front right. I slid in at the far end and moved close to her along the bench. She did not look surprised to see me. "In my experience, very little surprises, Mother Alcott," I said, very low. "I need to ask you something about the man at the altar, and I need you to tell me what your heart already knows." She held my gaze for one long moment. Then she looked back at the altar. She said, just as quietly, "I have been sitting here since the processional asking the Lord whether I was being an old fool." I said, "You are not." She reached into her lap. She was holding the wedding program, the folded ivory booklet with Adrienne and Elijah's names on the front. She had been holding it the entire service, not reading it, holding it. She said, "When I met him at the dinner last fall, we spoke for several minutes. He was gracious. Attentive in that particular way, that means he was deciding what impression to make. He asked how long I had been at this church. He asked about founding families. And then, casually, as if it were ordinary conversation, he asked after a family from our sister congregation in Memphis. The Hargrove family." She paused. The reason I knew that name was because about 3 years ago, a prayer request was circulated among several Black Baptist congregations in this region. A widow from that Memphis church, Sister Frances Hargrove, a retired schoolteacher, 67 years old, had been defrauded. She gave a significant sum of money to a man she believed she was in a relationship with for a healthcare investment opportunity that did not exist. He had found her through the church network. He called her something tender, a special name, just for her. The choir held a long note above us. I said, "Did the prayer request include a description of the man?" Mother Alcott said, "It included a photograph, a photocopy, not high quality, but..." She opened the wedding program slowly. She looked at the professional engagement photograph of Elijah on the inside page. She held it up slightly and looked at it the way a woman looks at something she has been trying not to be certain about for the past hour. She set the program down in her lap. She said, "The name in that prayer request, the name that man used with Sister Hargrove, was Calvin Reese." I sat with that for one breath. Same name. Both Marcus's Baton Rouge case and Mother Alcott's Memphis prayer request. Calvin Reese. A name circulated through the regional church network as a warning that had somehow not reached Greater Tabernacle before Adrienne found him. The same man, a different city, a different woman, the same approach, the church network, the charm, the special name, the fabricated investment, the financial destruction of a woman who had trusted a man she met in a sacred space. I squeezed Mother Alcott's hand and said, "I need you to be willing to speak to the pastor, privately, before this ceremony concludes." She said, without hesitation, "I have been willing since the processional. I was waiting for someone to come ask me." I moved back to my pew. Marcus was already there. He turned his phone screen toward me, held close and dimmed. It was a scanned document from his archived case files, the intake record from the Baton Rouge investigation with a photograph attached. The photograph was several years old and lower quality than the man at the altar, but the line of the jaw was the same, the way he held his chin. Marcus had sent the file to himself from his phone in the vestibule during the choir interlude. He said very quietly, "Calvin Jerome Reese, born Baton Rouge." The arrest record shows multiple aliases used across different states. Elijah Beaumont is one we didn't have documented. There are likely others. He looked toward the altar. "This is him, Loretta. This is the same man." I said, "I need to get to the First Lady. What I am about to tell you, I want you to understand clearly. What happened next was not a scene. It was not a spectacle. It was not the kind of moment you see in movies where someone stands up and shouts and the bride crumbles and the congregation erupts. That is not how we do things in the house of God. That is not how Reverend Whitfield runs his church. And it is certainly not how First Lady Gloria Whitfield operates. She is the reason this was handled with the dignity it deserved." I caught her eye from across the sanctuary during the transition moment as Reverend Whitfield prepared to move toward the exchange of vows. She had been watching me for the last several minutes. I knew it because First Lady Gloria watches everything. It is simply her nature, and I had been moving in ways that were purposeful enough to register. When our eyes met, I gave her the look that women in long church relationships develop over decades, a compressed communication, no words, that said, "I need you. It is serious. It cannot wait." She rose from her seat with the unhurried grace of a woman who has managed more than one delicate situation in this sanctuary and moved toward the side door that leads to the pastor's study with the expression of someone going to retrieve something they had forgotten. No alarm. No performance. Just movement. I rose and followed. The pastor's study is a small room lined with books and framed scriptures, with a desk and 4 chairs and a window looking onto the side garden. First Lady Gloria was already inside when I arrived. I closed the door. I spoke for 90 seconds. Court clerk's training. The facts in the order that mattered, without embellishment, without emotion. I told her about Marcus and the Baton Rouge case. I told her about Mother Alcott and the Memphis widow and the circulated prayer request. I showed her Marcus's phone with the archived case photograph alongside the wedding program photograph. I told her both sources had independently confirmed the same name, Calvin Reese. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. Then she said, "Where is your brother now?" I said, "Pew 3, left side." She said, "Mother Alcott?" I said, "Front right." "She is ready to speak." First Lady Gloria looked at the door to the sanctuary. From behind it, we could hear Reverend Whitfield's voice, guiding the congregation through the final preparatory moment before the exchange of vows. She said, "Loretta, I need to ask you one question, and I need your honest answer." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Are you certain enough that you would stake Adrienne's peace on it?" I held that question for one full breath. I thought about Adrienne's face coming down that aisle. I thought about the widow in Memphis who lost her late husband's savings to this man, or one using his name. I thought about the other woman in Baton Rouge who moved out of state rather than face the exposure of what had happened to her. I thought about what it would mean to be wrong. And then I thought about what it would mean to be right and say nothing. I said, "Yes, I am certain enough." She nodded once. She moved to the internal phone on the pastor's desk and pressed a single button. 3 seconds later, the door opened and Reverend Whitfield stepped in. He had been near the side entrance, which connected directly to the study, and she had signaled him in a way the congregation could not observe. He looked at his wife. She told him in 2 sentences. He looked at me. I confirmed it in 2 more. He looked at the phone screen Marcus had forwarded to mine, the case photograph beside the wedding program image. He was quiet for a moment. His face did what serious men's faces do when they receive serious information. It went absolutely still, and then realigned into the particular gravity of a leader accepting that something he had hoped would not be required is now required. He said, "I need you, your brother and Mother Alcott in this room. Give me 4 minutes to make a pastoral pause and have someone bring the groom to the study on my instruction." He looked at his wife. "Gloria, Adrienne first, before anyone else. She hears this from you, in private, before that man is confronted." First Lady Gloria moved toward the door. I put my hand on her arm. I said, "She needs to be able to choose what happens next. It has to be her choice." First Lady Gloria looked at me with an expression that said she had already decided exactly that. She said, "That is the only way I know how to do this." She went. I have thought many times since that day about what First Lady Gloria Whitfield said to my niece in the bridal suite in those minutes. I was not in that room. I do not know the precise words. What I know is what Adrienne told me afterward, that the First Lady sat beside her on the small settee, took her hands, and spoke to her the way a woman speaks when she has decided that the person in front of her is strong enough to receive the truth and deserving enough to receive it with gentleness. She told her what we knew. She told her the sources, her father's professional recognition, the archived case record, Mother Alcott's confirmation of the circulated warning. She told her we could not account for every detail, but that 2 independent sources had confirmed the same man and the same name, and that Adrienne needed to know before she made a vow she could not unmake. She told her that what happened next was entirely Adrienne's decision. Adrienne Celeste Simmons sat for 1 minute in silence. Then she pressed her hands flat on her knees. She looked at the First Lady, and she said, "I need to see my daddy." Reverend Whitfield returned to the sanctuary and did something I have never seen a pastor do in 26 years of membership. He stood at the altar, in front of the congregation, in the middle of a wedding, and said in a voice completely steady and completely kind, "I need to ask this congregation for something I have never asked before, and I ask it with the full love of this house behind it. I need everyone to remain seated and remain prayerful while I attend to a pastoral matter. This will take a few minutes. Please receive this moment as what it is, a church family caring for its own." He said nothing about the groom, nothing about fraud, nothing about false names. He simply made it a pastoral moment and walked to the side door. In the pew, the best man Deshawn looked around with the expression of a young man waiting for stage directions that were not coming. At the altar, the man who called himself Elijah Beaumont stood very still. I watched him through the cracked door of the study. I watched him the way I had watched witnesses in courtrooms for nearly 3 decades. not for what they showed, but for the moment the management slipped. He was still flawless, the composed expression, the slight forward lean in the direction of the side door where Adrienne had been, the posture of patient and devoted waiting. But his eyes moved, twice toward the side door, once toward the main entrance at the rear of the sanctuary. Back to the side door. He was calculating exits. He was doing it with almost no visible movement, the way a man does who has had occasion to calculate exits before. But the calculation was there, and I saw it, and it told me everything I needed to know about whether Marcus had been mistaken. He had not been mistaken. Deacon Raymond Foss, our senior deacon, 62 years old, 30 years in human resources and employee investigations, had been briefed in 2 sentences by the pastor and now stood at the side door of the sanctuary. He stepped in, moved to the altar with the unhurried authority of a man who has redirected difficult situations before, leaned toward the groom, and said quietly that the pastor needed him in the study for a brief moment before the ceremony continued. The man at the altar looked at Deacon Foss. He looked at the side door. Something moved behind his eyes. He came. In the study, Marcus sat across from the man who called himself Elijah Beaumont, with Reverend Whitfield at the head of the table and Deacon Foss seated beside the pastor. Mother Alcott sat to my left. Adrienne was not in the room. She was with her father in the small vestibule adjoining, present, within reach, but shielded from the direct confrontation. That had been her choice, when the First Lady gave her the choice. The man who had stood at an altar and called my niece my promise looked around the room. His eyes found Marcus. The management dissolved, just briefly, just for half a second. The practiced composure cracked at its edges in a way that no one in that room missed. And then the professional recovery happened. The slight reset of the jaw, the slight lift of the chin. And he said, "Is everything all right? Is Adrienne okay?" Reverend Whitfield said, "Adrienne is fine. She is with her father." He paused. Her father, Marcus Simmons, who spent 22 years as a criminal investigator with the district attorney's office in this county. The room was very quiet. Reverend Whitfield placed my phone on the table, the screen showing the case photograph from Marcus's archived file alongside the engagement portrait from the wedding program, and slid it across the desk. He said, "We are not the police. We are not here to make an arrest. We are a church family that loves a woman who deserves the truth. And we are asking you, in this room, before God and before these witnesses, to tell us your real name." The man at the other end of the table looked at the phone. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the door. Deacon Foss said quietly, "The door is not the answer you're looking for." 40 seconds of silence. 40 seconds in that small room lined with scripture and books, with the muffled sound of a congregation holding still on the other side of the wall. And then the man who had stood at an altar and called my niece my promise looked at the table and said, in a voice that had lost all of its warmth, "My name is Calvin Jerome Reese." Mother Alcott made a single small exhale, the sound of a woman who had been hoping she was wrong and had just confirmed she was not. Marcus sat with his hands flat on the table, steady. Reverend Whitfield said, "And the women in Memphis and Baton Rouge. There were others. It was not a question." Calvin Reese understood that. He did not answer it. Reverend Whitfield said, "You will not be marrying Adrienne Simmons today, and I need you to understand what that means in the complete sense. It does not mean you leave this building and construct another version of this story somewhere else. The people in this room have a case photograph, a circulated church network warning, and a retired investigator who worked your file. Deacon Foss has already placed a call to a contact at the county prosecutor's office, not to have you arrested in this building, but to ensure that what we have documented today is in the right hands by end of business." He held the man's gaze. "You are going to sit in this room with Deacon Foss until that call is returned and we know the appropriate next steps. This is not optional." He stood. He straightened his robe. He looked at me and nodded once. He walked back into the sanctuary. The congregation had been sitting in that particular suspended silence for nearly 20 minutes when Reverend Whitfield returned to the altar. He stood there, And he said, "Greater Tabernacle, I need to speak to you not as a ceremony officiant, but as your pastor. What I have to tell you is difficult, and I am going to tell you simply because you are a family, and families hold truth together. The wedding we were preparing to witness today will not be taking place. The reasons will be shared with the congregation in the appropriate time and manner. What I need from you right now is to receive this moment as the mercy that it is. God did not let something harmful be covered up in this sanctuary. That is not a tragedy. That is the grace of the Lord operating in the lives of people He loves." He paused. The room was completely still. Adrienne Simmons is in this building. She is surrounded by her family and her church. She is not broken. She is held. And I need every person in this room to honor her dignity by leaving this sanctuary quietly and prayerfully, and by keeping this family's business in your prayers and not in your conversations. A moment of silence. And then, beginning from Mother Alcott's pew and spreading backward through the sanctuary like a slow tide, people began to stand. They gathered their things with the particular care that people take when they understand that restraint is an act of love. No commotion. No rushed whispers. Just the quiet, dignified movement of a community that had been asked to be its best self and had chosen to be exactly that. I found Adrienne in the small side room off the vestibule with Marcus's arm around her shoulders. She was not crying. She had the still, glass-clear expression of a woman who has cried all she is going to cry in this particular hour and has moved into the place beyond it, the place where you start deciding what comes next. She looked up when I came in. I sat across from her and took her hands. She said, "Did he ever actually love me? Even a little?" I said, "I don't know, baby. I honestly don't know." She nodded, like that was the right answer, like she needed someone to not pretend. She said, "The name he called me, my promise." She looked at the window. "I wonder how many times he used that." I didn't answer. Some questions don't need an answer in the moment they're asked. They need to be carried for a while until they lose their sharpness. I said, "What I know for certain is that you are every good thing he called you. That part wasn't his to give you, and it isn't his to take." Something in her face moved. Not collapse, just a slow, quiet settling, like a woman finding the ground beneath her after a long time of not being certain it was there. Marcus tightened his arm around her. He said, "I should have met him sooner. I should have been in the same room with him before today." Adrienne leaned her head against his shoulder. She said, "Daddy, you got there in time. That's what matters." That undid him. A man who spent 22 years building walls around his reactions, who sat across from the man who tried to destroy his daughter without raising his voice. He pressed his face against the top of her head and held her, and the walls came down, and neither of them said anything for a while, and I sat with them because that is what family is for. Calvin Jerome Reese did not leave the building under his own power that afternoon. The contact Deacon Foss reached at the county prosecutor's office was a woman who had, it turned out, received correspondence 6 months earlier from an investigator in Louisiana trying to trace a Calvin Reese in connection with a reopened wire fraud case. The reopening had been prompted by the Baton Rouge victim who had previously moved out of state. She had reconsidered. She had contacted the DA's office again. She was cooperating. And now there was a second witness from Memphis, whose family had also recently agreed to come forward after learning of a third potential victim in Georgia. The pieces had been moving for months. They had simply not yet assembled themselves in the same room. They assembled themselves that afternoon, in a church study in the Mid-South, on a Saturday morning that was supposed to be a wedding. I will not tell you how the legal proceedings concluded, because they were still working through the system the last time I received an update. And I believe in the difference between what I witnessed and what I am speculating. What I will tell you is that the right people had the documentation. The witnesses were cooperating, and the man who had operated under multiple names in multiple states using faith communities as his hunting ground was no longer operating in anonymity. Adrienne took a month. She stayed mostly at home, saw mostly family, went to her church when she was ready, and sat in her pew and let the music do what music does. She did not perform recovery for anyone. She took the time it took. She came back to full life, to her hospital, her patients, her friends, her faith, in the quiet, determined way she does everything. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just steadily, one foot in front of the other, the way a woman walks when she has decided she is not going to let someone else's deception define the direction of her life. The sanctuary at Greater Tabernacle was full the first Sunday she came back. She walked in, and people made space for her the way a church community makes space when it is functioning as it should. Not with fuss, not with whispers, just with the widening of a pew and a hand on a shoulder, and the collective warmth of people who are genuinely glad you are here. Mother Alcott was in her front right pew, in white, gold brooch at her collar. When Adrienne passed her on the way to her seat, the old woman reached out and caught her hand briefly and held it. She said nothing. She did not need to. That is the church I know. Imperfect, complicated, sometimes asleep when it should be awake, but capable, when it is called to it, of being exactly what it is supposed to be. A house that does not let harm stay hidden. A community that catches its own when they fall. A place where the truth, however late, however painful, is understood not as punishment, but as mercy. Adrienne told me, about 3 months later, that she had asked God why he had allowed it to go so far. Why the relationship, the proposal, the engagement, the dress fittings, the 14 months of believing, why all of it, right up to the altar, before the exposure came. She said she had not received a clean answer. She said she thought maybe the answer was something like, because you needed to know exactly how well constructed a lie can be, so that when real love arrives, you will know the difference, not because it is louder, but because it is not afraid of the light. I thought that was one of the wisest things I had ever heard a 32-year-old say. Luke 8:17. Nothing is hidden that will not be revealed. Nothing concealed that will not be known. Not a threat, a promise, spoken by a God who sees everything, including the things we arrange most carefully to be unseen. If God has ever exposed something in your life, something that needed to come to light even though the timing felt impossible, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. You don't have to share the details. Just tell me, did you trust him through it? And what did the other side look like? Like this video if it stayed with you. Subscribe to Sister Circle Stories, because every week we tell the truth about the things that happen in the sacred spaces we call home. We are here. We are not going anywhere. This story is entirely fictional and created for narrative reflection and community conversation. All characters, churches, events, and situations depicted are imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is coincidental. The altar was dressed for a wedding. God had other plans.